The day Eleanor Vance decided my private cedar trail was HOA common property was the day she effectively lit a match in a room full of gasoline. And honestly, looking back, I don't think she ever realized just how badly she was going to get burned. My name's Elias Thorne, and for the better part of 15 years, I've lived a quiet, intentional life out here in Blackwood Ridge, working as a senior land surveyor for the county, which is basically a fancy way of saying I spend my days staring at property lines, iron pins, and deed descriptions until they're burned into the back of my eyelids. I'm the kind of guy who likes his peace, his privacy, and the smell of pine needles after a heavy rain, which is why I spent years clearing and maintaining a winding nature trail through the back 5 acres of my lot, a stretch of land that sits perfectly outside the neighborhood's common areas, though you'd never know it by the way Eleanor acted. Eleanor was the HOA president, a woman who treated our suburban cul-de-sac like her own private fiefdom, sporting a sharp, asymmetrical bob and a collection of power suits that always felt a little too stiff for a Saturday morning. She was famous for measuring the height of people's grass with a literal ruler and issuing fines for, and quote, unauthorized bird feeders, and quote. But her latest obsession was my trail, which she decided was and quote, shared community asset, and quote, just because a few neighbors had been using it as a shortcut to the creek for years. It all came to a head on a crisp October morning when I looked out from my back deck and saw Eleanor, flanked by 2 of her bored lackeys, Miller and Sarah, marching up my trail with clipboards in hand like they were preparing for an invasion. I stepped down into the yard, still holding a mug of coffee, and just stood there at the edge of the woods until they practically tripped over me, prompting Eleanor to give me that thin-lipped, synthetic smile that never quite reached her eyes. She didn't oppose to even say hello, just gestured vaguely toward the trees and told me they were conducting an, end quote, amenity audit, and quote, to integrate the trail into the HOA's master landscaping plan, claiming it had become communal property by, and quote, implied easement, and quote, since everyone used it. I felt that familiar, professional itch behind my eyes, the one I get when someone tries to tell me a boundary line is, and quote, somewhere over there, and quote. I told her flatly that the trail sat entirely within the metes and bounds of my deeded acreage, not the HOA's. She let out this tiny, condescending laugh, the kind you'd give a confused child, and told me that the board had already voted to designate it as, in quote, shared green space, in quote, and that I'd be receiving an official notice to remove my, in quote, private property, in quote, signage within the week. I stood there watching them walk away, feeling the silence of the woods settle back in, but this time it felt heavy, like the air right before a massive thunderstorm, because I knew right then that if I didn't oppose, push back, Eleanor would keep walking until she owned every square inch of my life. 3 days later, the letter arrived. Heavy stationery, embossed logo, the works, stating that effective immediately, my trail was and quote, public access corridor, and quote, and that any attempt to restrict access would result in a $250 daily fine for, and quote, obstruction of community amenities, and quote. They even had the audacity to suggest I should be, in quote, proud, and quote, to contribute to the neighborhood's aesthetic value, which was just code for, and quote. We want your land for free so we can hike up the property values, and quote. I didn't oppose to get angry, not the loud kind of angry anyway. I just went into my home office, pulled up the digitized plat maps from the county database, and printed out a stack of documents that prove my ownership back to the original 1990s development grant. I realized then that Eleanor wasn't oppose. Just being a nuisance. She was trying to pull a fast one on a surveyor, which is like trying to outgamble the house in Vegas. It's just not going to end well for you. Instead of arguing or calling her, I drove down to the local hardware store, bought 400 feet of high-grade privacy fencing, a heavy-duty steel gate with a keypad lock, and a several, in quote. No trespassing, private property, in quote, signs that were large enough to be seen from space. I spent the next 48 hours in the dirt, sweat-soaked and fueled by pure, unadulterated spite, until my trail was completely walled off from the rest of Blackwood Ridge, turning what used to be a convenient neighborhood shortcut into a fortress of solitude. The explosion happened on Monday morning, and I didn't oppose to even have to be outside to hear it, because Eleanor was practically screaming at my gate, her voice echoing through the trees like a shrill siren. I walked out to the fence, leaning against the post with a folder in my hand, and watched her face turn a shade of purple that I genuinely didn't and oppose. Think was biologically possible for a human being. She screamed that I was, end quote, defying a board order, end quote, and that I was, end quote, destroying the soul of the community, end quote, by cutting off the trail, especially since 3 homes on the adjacent street were currently on the market and had listed, end quote, direct trail access, end quote, as a primary selling feature. I just held up the folder, the deeds, the survey markers, the signed affidavit from the county clerk, and told her that unless she had a signed check for the market value of 5 acres of forest, she was currently standing on the wrong side of a very legal boundary. She threatened to call the police. She threatened to sue me into the Stone Age, and she even tried to shove the gate open, but it didn't oppose. Budge, so she finally stormed off, muttering about how I was a, end quote, selfish recluse, end quote, who didn't oppose. Deserved to live in a civilized neighborhood. But here's the thing about, end quote, community spirit, end quote. It's usually just a thin veil for self-interest, and it took less than a week for the real fallout to hit, starting with the real estate market. A neighbor I actually liked, a guy named Marcus who lived 3 houses down, stopped by a few days later looking like he'd just seen a ghost, telling me that the buyer for the house right next to the trailhead had just pulled their offer. Apparently, once they realized the, end quote, scenic nature trail, end quote, was actually a private backyard and was now permanently off limits, the house's appraisal dropped by nearly $60,000, and suddenly the, end quote, Eleanor fan club, end quote, started to shrink very, very fast. It turns out that when people lose 60 grand in equity over a petty power struggle, they stop caring about, end quote, community aesthetics, end quote, and start looking for someone to blame, and Eleanor was standing right in the center of the bullseye. But instead of backing down, she doubled down, which is the classic mistake of every tyrant who feels the ground starting to shake beneath them. She sent a white security SUV to park in front of my house at odd hours. She had Miller, end quote, accidentally, end quote, trip and knock over my garbage cans, and then she tried the ultimate, end quote, nuclear option, end quote, filing a petition for a prescriptive easement, claiming that because people had walked that dirt path for 10 years, it now belonged to everyone. I watched all of this play out through my security cameras, which I'd upgraded to 4K, because I wanted to make sure I caught every single detail of their desperation, and that's when I noticed something truly strange in the HOA's monthly financial disclosures. I have a friend at the county auditor's office, a woman named Clara, who has a nose for bad math, and when I showed her the HOA's line items for, end quote, legal consultation, end quote, and, end quote, trail development, end quote, her eyebrows shot up so high they almost disappeared in her hairline. The HOA had been funneling nearly $20,000 into a private account for a, end quote, consultant, end quote, named Gregory Vance, who, surprise, surprise, was Eleanor's brother-in-law, all under the guise of, end quote, securing community land rights, end quote. It wasn't an oppose, just a neighborhood spat anymore. It was a full-blown racketeering scheme, with Eleanor using my trail as the bait to funnel neighborhood dues into her family's pockets. I didn't oppose, go to the board, and I didn't oppose, go to the police, not yet. Instead, I went to a town hall meeting that Eleanor had called to, end quote, discuss the trail crisis, end quote, and I waited until she was mid-sentence, talking about the, end quote, importance of shared sacrifices, end quote, before I stood up in the back of the room with a stack of bank statements and emails I'd legally subpoenaed through a civil discovery motion. The silence that fell over that room was so thick you could have cut it with a knife, and as I walked down the aisle, laying out the evidence of the shell accounts and the kickback scheme with the local developer, I saw the blood drain from Eleanor's face until she looked like a wax statue in a heat wave. I told the room, my neighbors, my friends, the people she'd been lying to, that my trail was never about, end quote, community, end quote. It was a, end quote, product, end quote. She was trying to steal and sell to a developer who wanted to build luxury townhomes on the ridge. The room erupted, but it wasn't an oppose directed at me anymore. It was a wall of noise and fury directed right at the board table. And within 48 hours, the, end quote, impenetrable, end quote, Eleanor Vance was being served with a summons for a forensic audit and a multi-count felony investigation into the misappropriation of funds. It's funny how fast people turn on a leader when they realize they've been paying for their own robbery. And by the end of the month, the entire board had resigned in disgrace, leaving the neighborhood in a state of shock, but also, for the first time in years, a state of actual peace. They arrested Eleanor on a Tuesday. No sirens, no big show, just two detectives and a very quiet ride downtown. And the last I heard, she was taking a plea deal that involved a lot of community service and a permanent ban from ever serving on an HOA board again. The new board, led by Marcus, actually apologized to me, and they officially recorded and, quote, notice of non-easement, and quote, in the county records, ensuring that my trail would remain mine for as long as I lived in this house. Now, when I walk through those woods, the air feels different, lighter, cleaner. And while I occasionally let the neighborhood kids use the trail for school projects or nature walks, it's always on my terms with a knock on the door and quote, thank you, and quote. Afterward, I've realized that boundaries aren't and oppos. Just about wood and wire. They're about self-respect, and sometimes you have to close a path to remind people exactly who built it in the first place. But it makes me wonder, honestly, if you found out you're in quote, peaceful in quote, neighborhood was being run like a crime syndicate, would you have the stomach to tear the whole thing down, or would you just keep paying your dues and looking the other way? Because at the end of the day, a trail is just dirt and trees, but a home is wherever you're willing to draw the line and say, end quote, no further, end quote. And I'm curious, where do you draw yours? Drop a comment and tell me if you think I went too far, or if you would have done the exact same thing to save your slice of heaven.